첫 번째 연자를 소개해 드리겠습니다. 첫 번째 연자는 캐나다에서 윌리엄 오스월드 의료원에서 오신 로널드 헬스그레이브 박사님이십니다.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this morning. I expect this crowd will grow as the drizzle outside goes away, but being originally from the west coast of Canada, where rain is our friend, I thank you for the liquid sunshine that is bestowed upon us today. So I'm going to, and also let me extend my warm thanks to, as I did yesterday at this podium, to the organizers of this meeting and the invitation to come and share a little bit about what we're doing in Canada, with the hopes that this will, have some lessons that and takeaways that you can have as you move through what is a very difficult period that you're going through to really ramp up research ethics, over the course of, a decade or less, to the level that many of our countries have been working on for 50, 60 years. So I think this is a great achievement, and I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm going to talk about a few things today. I've spent a good deal of my career chairing IRBs, largely in the biomedical field, but what I'm going to talk about today are several things. I'll start with some information around clinical trials, and you can let me know whether this resonates here as well. But there has been a movement over the last number of years of where clinical trials are located, and I'll talk a little bit about that and some of the initiatives that are taking place in our country to try and regain some of those clinical trials for the innovative healthcare for patients in Canada. I want to move on to talk about engaging patients, because I think that's a very difficult, or at least it's been raised now, that engaging patients is one of the issues that is critical to clinical trials, but engaging subjects in research is the only way to have effective conclusions come from those studies, and we need to really pay attention to that. And in my view, we have not paid very much attention to that in the past. I want to tell you very briefly about some of the initiatives in Canada around improving ethics review and how one might do that in a more efficient way. But I want to spend most of my time, I think, talking about a concept that I'm calling for the time being a virtual consent platform, which I believe enhances informed consent and the informed consent process and can be applied to all areas of research. So in Ontario, which is the largest province in Canada and has about 50% of the research and development dollars in Canada, the pharmaceutical industry is heavily involved in doing clinical trials in Ontario to the tune of some $200, $250 million a year. But since about 2008, 2007 perhaps, we have been seeing a drop in clinical trial activity. And this is a bit alarming for politicians who are trying to increase research and development within the province and wondering, and there was a task force that said to the government, we should try and really intervene here and bring clinical trials back to Canada. So these slides sort of show that between 2009 and 10, there was a 12% drop in the clinical trial activity, clinical trial sites in Ontario, and really pretty much similar for Canada, and a further 11% drop from 2011 to 2012. And there's been a global trend really in clinical trials to move clinical trials out of developed economies and back in and into developing or undeveloped economies around the world. And so, I mean, this has a real implication for the care of patients in the in the developing or in the established economies. So this just shows you some clinical trials magnifier data. It's a bit old, but you can see that here that from the sites in North America, they're really fleeing to Asia, Eastern Europe, and a number of other sites as well. This is a bit better picture of it. And these data are a little bit dated as well. But you can see drops in Europe, drops in Canada, and significantly more drops in the US in terms of clinical trial activity going to Eastern Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The numbers are changing on this a little bit. BRIC countries were all part of this, so India was getting a lot of these trials as well. And the reasons for this are somewhat obvious, and they're largely related to economics. It's cheaper to conduct trials, as well as the healthcare system not being as advanced in some of the other countries, some of the developed economies, and therefore you can complete your clinical trial recruitment in short order, which also makes it more economic. Now, this is not because Canada doesn't have a place on the world stage in terms of clinical papers. This shows you some data that was gathered from our national funding agency, and you can see Canada here ranks about 5th in terms of its share of world clinical papers through citation indexes. When we take a look a little bit more specifically and look at health and look at general clinical kinds of papers, Canada actually ranks very high. So we have a lot of key opinion leaders in Canada. And in terms of overall clinical papers, largely through discovery, but also in applied health, we're very much a player in this. So why is it that we can't actually attract clinical trials to take place in Canada to the same extent that our leadership is reflected in data like this? Well, some of those are systemic problems. Problems to do with contracts and budgets with institutions and investigators, but largely to do with patient recruitment and enrollment. We're not very good at it. You know, there are other issues. So there are IRB issues, there are contract issues, and there are patient enrollment issues. So how do we solve this? This is, again, 2003 to 2005 data. But the increase is, these numbers, categories don't really change up until the last couple of years. This is some data from a 10-country comparison in 2008 and 2009, and you can see why pharmaceutical companies are going elsewhere. Heavy recruitment in Eastern Europe, Mexico, whereas Canada is just ahead of Sweden in terms of being able to recruit. And these established economies, okay, are providing better health care to all of its citizens as well. And so recruitment numbers are low. So this led to a call for action in 2010. And we wanted to try and see what we could do about this. We ranked 5th in terms of our share of trials, but having a steep decline coming. Global companies seem to be more attracted to emerging markets. So we had to reform this. And the government of Ontario put forward a concept called Clinical Trials Ontario. And Clinical Trials Ontario's vision was to make Ontario a preferred location for global clinical trials. This was our attempt to bring clinical trials back. It's only been around and functioning for about 3 years now. I was its inaugural executive director and got it formed and funded. But these are some of the things that we were hoping to do, and it's under new leadership now since I've moved on to another position. We wanted to mobilize the partners and move quickly to streamline ethics review and better engage patients in the process. So, and the hope was from the government that there would be greater investment in Ontario, access to leading edge medical research, and more evidence-based care being provided to our citizens. So they saw this as a growth opportunity, a job creation opportunity. Those of us more into the medical field saw this as a continuum of care. So for instance, clinical trials in the area of cancer are seen as part of clinical care, not something separate from it. So we wanted to bring it back for those reasons. Clinical Trials Ontario had three strategic pillars of reform that we wanted to do. One was to improve the speed and cost of multi-center trials in order to attract them back and create more streamlining in the ethics review world or the IRB world to get approvals, leveraging partnerships. But essential to this was engaging patients and the public to recognize the social benefits associated with participation in clinical trials. Most of what the public hears about clinical trials is what went wrong. But in fact, what we have is an important advance in science, an important advance in clinical care. People need to be aware of these successes that are a result of previous patients participating in clinical trials. So I won't spend much on the details of this, but again, we wanted to move to a single site review for clinical trials. As is the case here, every IRB in Korea, I'm sure, has their own view on a clinical trial, and you have to go through every one in order to get a clinical trial launched in the country. This is similar in the US and Europe and other areas, although there's been some consolidation in Europe. We want to implement standard operating procedures, improve communication and coordination, and also, more importantly, to track and document how we were doing and how the economic development was following our efforts at reform. So we want to develop a single point of entry for industry into multi-center clinical trials taking place in our jurisdiction. So we propose and are working on this kind of model. So Clinical Trials Ontario would receive clinical trials from either industry sponsors or individual investigators who want to conduct funded clinical trials. Clinical Trials Ontario would then select a particular IRB. In Canada, we call them Research Ethics Boards. And that IRB would act as a board of record for multiple institutions. We have proven this concept in Ontario in the cancer area, but not in other areas at this point. And this has been successfully operating for over a decade now. So you would get this, once it was approved by this board, it would not go to the other boards for the other institutions, but in fact would be a more general approval. And we're working on implementing this at the moment. But the other thing that I heard over and over again was we need to engage the public, build awareness, public awareness, distribute education about the social value associated with clinical trials, and develop educational strategies. So this is an ongoing initiative that has been worked on only for the last 3 years, really. And it's starting to gain some traction. Whether it's enough traction to attract clinical trials back to Canada is a work in progress. We'll have to see. And we felt to support this, we established a number of working groups, including looking at the model and evaluating the model for IRB board of record approaches, developing an informational framework and technology that would allow us to do this seamlessly across institutions, because many institutions have developed their own technology to do this. And of course, when that happens, technologies don't talk to each other readily. And it was important to us to also get a lot of legal input so we could look at the legal and liability issues associated with this kind of model. I'm going to skip now to some other areas that were taking place at the same time. And this is a report, a very brave report, in my view, from a standing committee of our Senate, which is, and I understand you don't have an upper chamber of Parliament, but this is our upper chamber of Parliament, and it's the Senate. And this Senate committee took on the role of how do we improve clinical trial infrastructure. A very specific topic for a Senate Standing Committee dealing with science and technology. But they felt it was important. It was chaired by Kelvin Ogilvie, and I credit him with actually moving this forward in short order. For those of you that may be physicians. You're probably familiar with the antiviral ganciclovir. I think part of the success of this was that Kelvin Ogilvie was the inventor of ganciclovir many years ago, and he brings that kind of clinical expertise to the table. So they produced a report for Health Canada, which Health Canada had to act upon, and they made the following recommendations. And this really shows the deficiencies in Canada as well. And I don't know how many of these relate to Korea. So develop a national framework for coordinating clinical trials. This cannot be, what we're trying to do in a province cannot be sufficient. It has to be at least countrywide. And so it shows you we also didn't have a coordinating center for clinical trials. Accreditation for IRBs was another recommendation that they heard loud and clear and recommended this to the government. So our IRBs are not accredited, unlike they are in many other jurisdictions. They operate independently. Facilitate participant recruitment. This is again a recommendation that was important. So they were recognizing and hearing from patient advocacy groups as well that patients aren't engaged in research and the clinical trial process, and we need to develop that. Another big issue for them was orphan drug framework, and we didn't have an ability to deal with orphan drugs that were not of interest very much to pharmaceutical companies, and how do we enhance that? Again, coordinating clinical trials for other kinds of rare disorders as well. And finally, which I thought was very nice because they included proposed recommendations for evaluating whether or not these recommendations work, which is not what you often see from high-level government reports. They went on to produce two other reports, post-approval marketing. So many drugs change their value once they are marketed. Adverse events that hadn't been seen in carefully controlled clinical trials come out in post-marketing surveillance. I'm assuming it is the same here, but many groups of populations actually don't have approved drugs. For instance, children. Children are all off-label for most of their drugs that they need. And it's all based on adult studies because we don't involve children in many of these studies. And again, they went on to look at off-label use as well. So they've produced 3 reports, and they're about ready to produce their final report, which is how has the government done in recognizing our recommendations and moving forward with them. So again, it's a bold move from the Senate, and we're hoping the government pays attention to that. So I've talked about a number of issues, and in the last 10 minutes, 12 minutes I've got, I want to talk about ways to enhance patient engagement. And I'm going to center this around the informed consent process, which is common to all kinds of, every kind of research. And I'm going to use a more behavioral observational kind of approach to this. And this comes out of another initiative within Ontario in the last 3 years as well. So I'm going to talk about a virtual consent platform here. And what I mean by that is a way of getting virtual access to the consent information and new issues for patients and sponsors. And I think that it is something that we're trying to build a virtual consent platform primarily to enhance the information and patient understanding, participant understanding of what they're getting engaged with if they participate in a particular research project. And we should do this on a transactional basis as well, so that as things change, we can reconsent in a dynamic way as necessary and track and verify those changes. I don't think we do any of this very well now. And certainly from a clinical trials perspective, when you see a consent form that is 25 pages long, in sometimes very sophisticated language, and half your population, at least half of our population in Toronto, English is not their first language. Are we really providing them with an informed consent, or are we providing them with a piece of paper? So I think there are a number of advantages for this, enhancing the current consent, using multimedia approach. These are all at our fingertips today, and providing them with a bit more information that is geared to their level of understanding. And what I'm proposing here is we start with a simple consent and have a dynamic expansion of that consent to address the needs of participants at any given time. This would promote multilingual ease, cultural sensitivity to different populations, and increase access to potential participants in future research. This can all be done through a web portal. It has the and if it's done through that, we have an ability to actually monitor that web portal to better understand what aspects of information will lead to the decision-making on the basis of potential participants in research studies. We don't understand how participants make that final dichotic decision, yes or no. And we need to better understand that to put more appropriate information in the consents, rather than what we've done up to this point, which is to grow the size of the consent so you cover off all eventualities. That doesn't seem to be appropriate. I'm proposing this kind of virtual consent platform, which will allow us to give better, more targeted information on the basis of what the patient needs, while not denying them anything at the same time. So again, I've talked a little bit about this, and in fact, you could use this web portal, in fact, to pre-consent or self-consent individuals into a study. It doesn't mean that you don't have a conversation with them. It means you provide them with the information they need to see if they need more information. This has the advantage, this concept of being implemented globally, improving communication, verifying some understanding, so you can question their understanding as part of this consenting process in a very easy way, and provide patients on a continuous basis with the ability to exercise their rights, i.e. withdrawal from the study, by providing them with appropriate information. Again, we talked about this, and this should markedly reduce the time required to consent and the expense required to consent multiple individuals, and help correct for some of the attrition that happens after you've consented them and before the study starts and they drop out. So I've got a particular example. This is from another initiative. The Ontario Brain Institute is looking at doing observational studies across multiple mental disorders or brain disorders. So they will have a common data set for epilepsy, depression, Alzheimer's disease, et cetera, to look for commonalities. It's a $100 million initiative that the government put into this over a 5-year span. So the way this would work is that you have you log in like anywhere else with a username and password so that you have protected information. Perhaps you have the PI, in this case it's Dr. Michael Strong in London, Ontario, who is heading this particular neurodegenerative project, and the PI of the overall study could give you the information, basic information you need on this. It doesn't mean that the local people are not involved in this, but again, again, you can get it from the expert who can explain it better than anyone else. You can introduce the study, what is dementia in this case, and how does it affect people, and these are the 5 different kinds of neurodegenerative disorders that are being looked at in this particular study: Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, ALS, frontal temporal dementia, and vascular dementia. So we have all of these opportunities. We can embed in this for people to have a better understanding, pictures of the brain and what it does. We can have a very simple script that would allow you to move forward and provide information to prospective patients and with specific information on different kinds of diseases. So if this is an Alzheimer's patient, you can have a menu that you can pick in order to have this consent be appropriate. And you can animate, what happens to an Alzheimer's brain, Alzheimer's patient's brain. Parkinson's, same thing. Show a picture of the dopamine pathway and how that becomes ineffective in Parkinson's. Neuroimaging, a lot of difficulty explaining some of this to patients, neuropsychology, neuroimaging, ocular, gait, and coming down to genomic issues. So we got paper and pencil memory tests, et cetera, for neuropsychology. We've got a gait assessment. What's a gait assessment? How am I going to maneuver this in this study? But you can actually explain it very simply to them. So there's a lot of things in consent forms that scare people off. So you can have, sorry, there's an embedded video here. Apparently a very short one. So having said that, we can talk about neuroimaging. This is a very scary thing to describe in a consent form for a lot of patients. And we can change that to something like this.
Up on the bed. Okay. These squeeze ball, so there's where you see you can call me. This could have done this a little bit better. Okay. Off you go. Are you okay? Good.
Again, I think you'd agree this is a much friendlier way of getting this information to potential people involved in behavioral studies that would require neuroimaging. Again, what's eye tracking? Something that people don't know much about. And there is video, but
a task will be explained to you that involves looking at dots as they appear on the screen. The high-speed camera will be tracking your eye movements as you complete the task.
so again, giving the information they need in a way that they can consume that information and make sense of it. Again, simple understanding of what genomics is about and what's involved in it from a patient perspective, not from a scientific perspective. All of the common things about withdrawal, benefits, compensation, if there is any, can be part of this, and as can be what happens to these data later. This happens to be a place for this particular project. There's a centralized data repository that will hold all of these data and link all of these data together in order to make sense across disorders. So contact information, there's regular kinds of things can be part of this, but again, you start out with something simple, expand it in a way that makes a lot more sense, and in fact, we're informing patients to a greater extent. So again, signing these things is a virtual, we can have virtual consents these days, electronic consents. So my message really is in this, whatever we do, we need to get patients more involved from an ethical, health, and advocacy perspective, because we too will be these patients in coming years, and think of how we want to be treated, and let's start that process now. Thank you very much.